Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in if you are watching now. This was supposed to be a Facebook Live, but we had some technical difficulties, as you know, happens. So we are just here to record a little bit for you to learn about Miranda and the new collaborative learning groups that they will be facilitating for some of our DB program members. So welcome if you're here. We're glad you're tuning in, and I will let Miranda introduce himself.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. Well, welcome everyone. We are adapting. We're adapting to our Zoom and Facebook world. So thank you for adapting with us. We really appreciate it and being understanding and meeting us where we're at. As mentioned by Hannah, my name is Miranda. I use they, them, their, and she, her pronouns. I am new to Violence Free Colorado. I am their culturally responsive technical assistance specialist. And I'm really excited to just begin getting connected to programs and organizations. A little bit about myself is I grew up here in the Boulder area. So I was born in Boulder, which tends to be a shock for a lot of folks. Everybody's like, you're from Boulder. Yes, I was born in Boulder. So fun fact. My family wasn't always originally from Boulder. My family actually traveled here to be able to, my grandma traveled here to be able to go to the university and be able to go to colleges. And so that's kind of what brought our family up in this area. One thing that's always important for me in kind of introducing myself, I am a Two-Spirit Heniceto Apache. I'm part of the Heniceto Apache and Navajo tribe. I always like to give acknowledgement to the land that we exist within, right? We exist within the context, and there's always history to where we're at. And so acknowledging that our land is Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho land is always an important piece, and then also just really acknowledging the folks who have done a lot of the work to get me to where I am today, right? And being able to connect with you all. So thank you all for sharing space with me today. I mean, how much do you want to know about me? There's so many things.
Yeah, well, what brought you to, I guess, what did you do a little bit around your work before coming to Violence Free Colorado? And then what brought you to this position? What excited you about it? Or what are you hoping to do in your role? Just so, because if folks who are watching are new, Miranda's position is new with the coalition, and we're excited about a lot of the opportunities that provides for us and our members. Yeah.
So the story of how I got to Violence Free Colorado is definitely a much bigger story, right? The reason why I got into the work that I do was really around breaking silences within my own family, right? So I've done a lot of work previously in the past with around child abuse and neglect and survivors of child abuse and neglect, as well as domestic violence. And like many folks who are in this field, oftentimes it's because we have some type of experience, right? And so growing up, I was raised by very strong matriarchy in my family. And one of the main pieces that as I began to get older that I began to witness was not only witnessing like the resiliency and witnessing kind of all of the things that they have gone through and how they got through them and all of those pieces, but also kind of the similarities in their stories in regards to domestic violence, racism, child abuse, like all of those different pieces, again, speaking to like some of those historical traumas. And then also being able to share witness to like how they taught with each generation survival and kind of what the storytelling and how important that role was. And all of those really important pieces began to really shape kind of who I was as I began to get older, right? Mm-hmm. I have 3 kiddos and a partner. And, as mentioned, my family kind of moved up this way to be able to go to the university. I am a first generation graduate from CU Boulder in ethnic studies and sociology. And my main focus during college was really exploring kind of the witnessing and telling the stories of my family. So oftentimes a lot of the stories of things that I had experienced, I never really found in the curriculum or the books or those types of things. So really began in college to explore some of those pieces. So I connected with the women in my family and kind of created the space for them to tell tell me their stories, like parts of their stories that I never really got to witness. And so that was huge for me, right? And really beginning to grapple with, like, how do we break silences, especially around domestic violence, right? How do we break some of these pieces to teach, to really intentionally teach healing and generational healing and all of these different components, because that was important for me as well, as I was kind of coming into parenthood. And so I did a lot of research within domestic violence and generational violence within the Chicana, Chicanx community specifically, and how to break those silences. And so that's kind of what got me in that work. And during that time, I had also done a lot of child abuse and neglect work as well. So I had volunteered for a lot of nonprofits in that piece. And then I eventually found an organization that I wanted to volunteer for. It was a domestic violence shelter. And so I started volunteering in a domestic violence shelter. And, I really loved being in an environment that, and meeting and connecting people where healing was such a big component, right? It's always hard because when I say that, like, I've worked at a domestic violence shelter, the reaction is always like, how do you do that? Like, that's so hard. Yeah. Yes. And it also can be a very beautiful thing, healing and witnessing each other and the way in which community is created through some of those, experiences and storytelling and that piece, right? So I volunteered at the domestic violence shelter for a while, and then I eventually transitioned into their crisis line manager. And then I also worked with the volunteers and interns, and I did that for quite a while. And then I transitioned into the shelter program director. And so then it really helped me kind of also get more into, like, policy and protocol and, all of those pieces. One thing that played a really big role in my growing up were, like, all of my different experiences and identities and how that all kind of created who I am today. And so I worked in the DV shelter for a long time. Eventually, I transitioned into working with Child Protective Services. So I worked with Child Protective Services for a while. And again, it was also my kind of the core of the work that I like to do, or the work that kind of fuels me, and my passion is around witnessing each other's stories. How do we witness each other's stories? How do we heal from that? How do we learn from those things? And so, working at a shelter really helped me understand as well that there's a lot of intersections between systems. So Child Protective Services, DV, right, some of these big pieces that all kind of work together in a lot of different ways. So, and then I got burned out. And my body was like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So I took a break in that work specifically, and then I started doing a lot of work within the LGBTQ plus community, and I was on a board of LGBTQ organization, as well as I was their chair of their Queer Trans Folks Approach Steering Committee. So really began working closely with, again, very resilient communities that have a lot of again, witnessing in stories, and how do we do that, and all the different components of that, which eventually kind of transitioned me into finding Violence Free Colorado, and being able to work with you all, which is, a great honor, and I'm super excited about, and the role in which, I'm kind of coming into at Violence Free Colorado, as Hannah mentioned, is a new role. So it's a role that hasn't been created here at Violence Free Colorado yet, which I'm really excited about, right? To be able to, create something and work with community and begin making those connections. So that's what brought me here.
Thank you so much for sharing, Miranda. Like a little bit of your story, because I think that's important for us to know about you and everything that you're bringing to your work here. And I think also just signals like such a wide array of experiences and like different elements of the field that you've worked in. So hoping, I guess, tying kind of to the collaborative learning group opportunity, which we're going to talk about a little bit coming up here. I think that your facilitation and your experience, both personal and professional, will be really helpful for kind of bringing folks together who want to talk about, like, how do we serve survivors better? because that's like one of the main questions facing us that kind of has been always facing us, whether we we're acknowledging it or not, right? Like how well is our field serving all survivors when we say that that's what we want to do? Yeah, so also very excited. This has become kind of like a love fest, but also very excited to work with you. And here I'm like, some of this is new to me too, as your colleague, just hearing this for the first time. So, yeah, so thank you for sharing. And do you want to tell everybody a little bit more about the groups and what you're hoping for?
Okay. Absolutely. And so from my journey, like what, and working with survivors, what I began to realize is, as you had mentioned, like the process in which and way we've talked about like trauma and domestic violence and all of these different pieces has evolved and changed over time, right? And so, we're at a point in time where like, okay, well, where are we, right? Like, where are we at this point in time and what does that mean? And really embracing the beauty of like transition and process, is where like I truly believe we are in this space, right? When we are rethinking or when we are continuing to like relearn about what it means to, be a survivor and different identities in all of those ways and how we can actually support survivors fully, their existence fully. Like how do we do that? And I know that all of the organizations that we do, like that's their core, right? That's their goal. That's the reason why we do what we do, is to be able to support survivors in healing and self-sufficiency and all of those different ways. And so the questions that we're kind of creating now are, what does that mean at this point in time, right? I think some of the models in which we have thought about violence and thought about gender-based violence or all these other, intersectional violence and pieces of oppression have served a purpose for us. And like, we also have to continue to grow on them, right? We have to continue to evolve in our thinking about the ways in which we, approach them. And so the Learning Collaborative and, my role specifically with Violence Free Colorado as their culturally responsive, trauma-informed, person is to be able to really explore that and also understand that like it's always going to be ever changing. So when we are working with survivors, what does it mean to bring in their whole existence? What does it mean to talk about the ways in which, me as a queer person has had intersections with domestic violence in a way that's unique? Me as a person of color has had intersections with, domestic violence in a way that's unique, right? So really being able to embrace all the ways in which I have existed up to this point, and creating support and systems around all of those things. So really it's the opportunity to just kind of broaden and expand the ways in which we support survivors, is kind of my hope and my goal, right? So when we're looking at, and then how does that play out within our different systems? I think that part of my role and the way that I see my role is I have privilege working in a system. I have privilege being, English being my primary language, having citizenship here in the United States, right? And so, and then having an education that allows me in these realms to be able to kind of heal through some of my trauma in the way that other folks may not have access to, right? So I feel that my role in some way is to be able to support in that. And how can we do that over institutions? How can we do that in our organizations? How can we do that through policy and protocol in a way that, really positions us to reflect on, what we're currently doing, what's working, and what areas do we have growth, and like what are the possibilities of ways that we can continue to grow that to be more inclusive in our policy and protocols, to really kind of evaluate that on a multi-level way within organizations. So the collaborative learning group that we are going to be beginning, applications are currently open right now. And we'll send information on that, but is to be able to work with, DV organizations to be able to talk about how can we implement some of these things within, organizations, policy and protocol, within our thought processes, and really begin to try and meet folks where they're at, because that's an important part of the process, is we're all in different places, right? We all have different stories. We all have different experiences. And so we're bringing that with us into these, collaborative group settings And so how can we kind of work together to create a movement within our organizations that really centers, trauma-informed practices for, what I call resilient communities. So communities that have experienced multiple systemic stressors, historical trauma, all of these different components. So I'm excited about their Learning Collaborative.
Yeah.
It's going to be, the first Learning Collaborative will be a 6-month duration. Okay. And again, part of this is growth, part of this is learning, part of this, and I'm excited to do that with folks. We will be meeting 2 times a month for 90 minutes each. And really, again, kind of reflecting, having it be a reflective process on where are we at? What does that mean? What are we currently doing? How can we grow? How can we be a support to each other? And I think that's one of the biggest pieces is like, even with survivors, isolation is a big part of, what stops healing from happening. And so I also see that on an organizational level. How can we as organizations be support for each other in the work that we're doing and share content, share resources, share knowledge, so that we also don't feel so isolated, right? So that burnout is not so intense that, like myself, I get to a point where I'm like, so burnt out, right? So how can we kind of create our own environments within our organization that really promote growth?
Yeah, I think something that you said is really powerful about like, so that people don't feel so isolated and also are like more working together in this, because as we know, like within kind of like the nonprofit world, this sense of like competition or like we're competing for funders or like that is something that I think the nonprofit community is still trying to shake off. It's kind of like hard when we all live under capitalism to do that, right? So I just like that is it sounds like a very intentional part of what the groups will be, and probably things that you all are going to be talking about, like how do we really work together when it's so easy to feel like resources are scarce maybe, or like staffing is scarce, time is scarce, like everything is scarce. Yeah,
it's so true. And what I loved about this initial creation process of these resilient communities collaborative groups is that I have also been connecting with folks in other states, right? So it's not only in a Colorado setting that we can create connections amongst organizations, but it's also in like a much wider network, a much wider web of communities who are doing this work, and again, who are at varying levels of where we're at in this work, but also being able to connect with folks in Alaska and New Mexico and New York, to talk about like what's happening in your area around accessible, culturally responsive, trauma-informed practices, like where what's happening in your world around some of the much wider conversations around equity and justice and all of those pieces. So my hope is to at some point really also incorporate that within the collaborative groups, right? So that even Colorado has an understanding and a knowledge of feeling that like we also have resources outside of kind of that piece, right? We are in a much larger movement together. And so that's kind of my hope, and it's been super exciting to really kind of connect with folks to witness where they're at in this process as well.
Awesome. So it sounds like you would be looking for programs who already are domestic violence service programs who serve survivors, many of whom throughout the state are members of the coalition. So so folks should apply. When should they apply by?
So as of right now, the application deadline is Friday of next week. So would that be the 28th?
Yes, May 28th.
The 28th. And then, my contact information is there. If you have any kind of questions in which, you're unsure or on the fence or need a little bit more clarification, definitely feel free to connect with me. I'm more than happy to kind of talk through some of those pieces. I get that this could be a really big commitment, especially after working in, domestic violence shelters. Like, I get the complexity to what a commitment like this actually means. So definitely connect with me so that we can kind of work through some of those pieces. And then the hope is that then the collaborative learning groups will begin in August. So July will kind of be spent really connecting and getting to know the folks who are in the collaborative learning group, and then August will be the goal for when we're beginning to have these connections.
Cool. Okay, great. And just to clarify for DB program members, it's obviously a really, it's a big commitment in that it's time and it's dedicating staff to do it, but it is free, correct?
Yep.
Okay, great.
It is free and it's virtual.
And it's virtual. Okay, awesome. And Miranda, can you talk a little bit about some of the benefits that you think organizations will get out of this collaborative learning group if they would choose to apply and participate?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of some of the benefits in being a part of this learning collaborative group are being able to get one-on-one support from Violence Free Colorado. So not only is part of the collaborative is being able to connect with other organizations, which is a big piece of it, right? So sharing knowledge, sharing resources, really kind of creating a network of support for each organization the best that we possibly can. And then also from Violence Free Colorado. So some of the work that we may be identifying is that specific organizations may need specific support in a certain area. And we can offer, specialized individual training for organizations to be able to support their staff in some of those different processes. A lot of what's happening right now as well is, some of the work around accessible, culturally responsive, trauma-informed practices are also in some funding. And so, what our hope is that it's more than kind of, checking a box and doing some of those components, but also really having the support needed to kind of dive into why this work is important and how it could be beneficial for each organization, and how, embracing the, survivors and their whole experiences is definitely beneficial. What organizations will most likely begin witnessing is people will access their services in a different type of way, right? You may, folks that you may be like, I'm unsure why they're not accessing our services. You may see an increase in that, right? Just kind of being able to create space for survivors often allows the opportunity to be able to support them. And then they may seek our services in a specific way. And then it also helps with burnout. Oftentimes doing models such as these helps give more agency to staff. It helps really promote independence and agency for survivors. Therefore, it creates an environment oftentimes that feels in a lot of ways, in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis, it can be very, very heavy on the heart. And so not that won't be the case, but it also helps, not only survivors, but staff feel a lot of support and input in some of the policies and processes that are at play. Those are just a few things.
Yeah, I think those are all huge benefits. Of part of advocacy is often now saying oh, I don't have that resource that you need, right? Or I can't support you in that way for a variety of reasons. And that is really hard on advocates too. Fundamentally, it is hard for survivors because they're not getting the help that they need, right? And it's also very hard for staff to deny people their basic human needs. So I think anytime we're getting closer to hey, we can support people on a human level based on their needs, it is so much better and easier for everyone involved. So thank you all for watching. Hope you learned a little bit about what to expect from these collaborative learning groups that are starting up. We hope you apply or ask questions, even if you're just interested in learning a little bit more to see if it's something that will fit with your agency. So please do, again, check the comments for all the contact info and the additional information, but please do reach out to Miranda if you have any of those questions. And yeah, we're excited to get started on this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone. And it's so nice to be connected to you all.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Miranda.
Thank you.